Over 100 years ago, the USS Maine was on a visit to Havana, Cuba, when the battleship mysteriously exploded, killing most of the crew and sparking off the Spanish-American War. Now, over a century later, an international team of scientists searches the deep waters off the coast of Havana, hoping to find the wreck of this once mighty ship, the U.S.S. Maine, an American legend on the ocean floor.
Guantanamera, Guajira, Guantanamera, Guantanamera, Guajira, Guantanamera. Yo soy un hombre sincero, de donde crece la palma. Yo soy un hombre sincero, de donde crece la palma. Y antes de morir yo quiero cantar mis versos del alma.
This is modern-day Havana, the capital city of the island of Cuba, just 90 miles south of Key West. Havana is a bustling metropolis of over 2 million people. A full 1/5 of Cuba's population calls Havana home. Havana is a city undergoing a rejuvenation, a facelift of sorts, peeling away years of neglect to reveal stunning architectural detail and forgotten historical treasures. These improvements are necessary as tourism is Havana's lifeblood. On any given day, thousands of visitors from around the world flock to the island to enjoy Cuba's famous music, art, and Latin Caribbean culture. Any observant tourist would quickly notice that life in Havana revolves around the sea. The epicenter of Cuba, and indeed the entire Caribbean, has long been Havana Harbor. Officially discovered in 1492 by Christopher Columbus, the island of Cuba became a possession of the Spanish Empire, and the port of Havana quickly became the doorway to the New World. Ships laden with gold and treasure stopped in Havana to take on provisions for the long journey back across the Atlantic. Such a valuable port needed protection from marauding pirates, so the Spanish built the intimidating El Morro Castle and equipped it with an impressive array of cannons. Cuba was Spain's lucrative island fortress at the entrance to the New World. But Spain was not a gentle ruler. Cuban revolts against the corrupt Spanish government flared up regularly. The Spanish throne wasted no time sending huge numbers of troops and supplies to squelch the small bands of Cuban insurgents. By the end of the 19th century, tensions on the island of Cuba were running high. Into this political hotbed steamed the brand new American battleship, the U.S.S. Maine. On the morning of January 25, 1898, the Maine entered Havana Harbor, ceremonial colors flying, never to leave again. 3 weeks later, the Maine was destroyed in an explosion that claimed the lives of 266 crewmen, making it the deadliest peacetime naval incident in American history, and the most mysterious. Who blew up the Maine? Was it the Spanish, as popular belief held? Or the Cuban insurgents hoping to draw the United States into their conflict? Or was it an accident, perhaps caused by a fire in one of the Maine's coal bunkers? The explosion remains a mystery to this day. The battleship Maine was one of the first armored cruisers in Teddy Roosevelt's new Navy. In 1883, Congress approved the building of several new battleships to replace the U.S. Navy's antiquated Civil War sailing vessels.
This would be one of the first ships armored with steel, the U.S. battleship Maine. That steel would be made in the United States. The design of the ship would be created in the United States. It would actually be built in a United States Navy shipyard. All of this was radically new. The Maine and her sister ship, the Texas, would be the first of the American Navy to actually be an American ship. So not only was the Navy itself proud of this vessel, but all of the people in the United States were proud of the battleship Maine. She was a very, very special United States naval vessel.
The pride of the American fleet cost an astounding $2.5 million to build. The Maine was one of the first battle cruisers to be equipped with electric light fixtures, over 400 in all. Her naval weaponry was the most advanced available: 4 impressive 10-inch cannons, half a dozen 6-inch guns on swiveling bases, 7 rapid-firing 6-pounders, and 4 torpedo tubes. The Maine was 319 feet long, carried a crew complement of 392 men, and her engines could pump out over 9,000 horsepower. Most importantly, the Maine could cruise for 7,000 miles without recoaling due to her enormous coal bunkers. This alone was her most significant benefit to the new Navy, as coaling stations available to American fighting vessels were few and far between. A huge crowd turned out to witness the launching of the Maine on a cold November Tuesday in 1890. 20,000 spectators showed up at the New York Navy Yard to watch the christening. Even the grapes for the champagne had been grown on American soil in San Bernardino, California. Young Alice Tracy Wilmerding, granddaughter of the new Secretary of the Navy, did the honors. In her nervousness, she might not have realized that she struck the ceremonial bottle in a somewhat objectionable location.
When she struck the Plimsoll line, she hit the champagne bottle on the number 13. And some in the crowd noted that. There were some words among the crew that had already been selected for the battleship that this could be a very ominous sign.
It took another 5 years after her launching before the superstructure of the Maine was completed and she was finally ready for sea duty. No one knew that her lifespan would be pitifully short. The Maine had taken over 9 years to design and build. She would be in commission for less than 29 months. As the Maine went about her initial duties of training exercises and ceremonial visits, the situation in Cuba was worsening. News of Spanish atrocities and of Cuban suffering was reaching the sympathetic ears of the American public. This news was spread primarily by 2 New York newspapers: the Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, and the World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer. Both Hearst and Pulitzer quickly discovered the insatiable appetite of the American public for news about the turmoil in Cuba, factual or not. A war for circulation ensued.
They would send reporters down to Havana, and they spent most of their time in the bar at the Inglaterra Hotel making up stories, but there actually were some good reporters who went out into the field and did serious work. Some of them perhaps working for the U.S. intelligence as well as their newspaper bosses.
Although the stories reported in the World and the Journal were oftentimes larger than life, the crimes being committed against the Cuban people were quite real. Spain sent General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba to crush the Cuban uprisings once and for all. Promptly dubbed the Butcher by the New York newspapers, Weyler employed harsh tactics to end the rebellion. His reconcentrado plan called for all Cubans living in the countryside to be relocated into concentration camps to deprive the insurgents of their sources of food and supplies. The reconcentrado families were forced to leave their farms and animals behind, and they began to starve under the horrible conditions in the camps. News and pictures of starving Cubans, along with inflammatory editorials, outraged the American public. President William McKinley, whose goal was to avoid war at all costs, was coming under more and more pressure from Congress to respond to the violence and to protect American interests in Cuba. Teddy Roosevelt and other ultra-patriotic Americans known as Jingos saw the conflict in Cuba as the perfect opportunity to acquire Spain's colonies and extend the power of the U.S. War fever was beginning to grip the United States. The tiny island of Key West, just 90 miles from Cuba, was becoming the center of operations for support of the Cuban Revolution. The island's proximity to Cuba made it an ideal hub for running contraband guns and supplies to the Cuban insurgents, an illegal but highly popular activity known as filibustering. In March of 1897, after a particularly large delivery of guns and explosives, Spain demanded that the United States put a stop to these filibustering expeditions.
In response to that, the President of the United States and Secretary of the Navy decided to send the battleship Maine to Key West and some other naval vessels to survey the coast and to interfere in these filibustering expeditions wherever they could. So the battleship Maine came here to keep the peace, to keep United States citizens out of an ever-growing and ever more violent conflict between Spain and Cuban insurgents on the island of Cuba.
Charles Dwight Sigsbee was in command of the Maine at the time she was dispatched to Key West. An impressive figure with his long mustache and impeccable attire, Captain Sigsbee had acquired a reputation in the Navy for coolness under pressure.
That got commendations, his coolness under stress. He prided himself on that. He used to say in his letters to my grandmother, when she'd say, "I suppose you feel very anxious or something," he would reply, "I never feel." He prided himself in that.
At the same time that Captain Sigsbee was setting the Maine's course to Key West, the Butcher, General Weyler, was recalled to Madrid, and a more moderate general named Blanco was sent as his replacement. General Blanco immediately put an end to the reconcentrado plan. But it was too late. An estimated 100,000 Cubans had already died in the camps. The Cubans who survived had no farms to return to. Worse yet, many of the young Spaniards in Cuba were furious that their glorious leader, General Weyler, had been removed. This group of military dissidents became known as Weylerites. In January of 1898, riots broke out in Havana, blamed on the hothead Weylerites. The American consul in Havana, General Fitzhugh Lee, cabled Washington imploring that a battleship be sent to protect Americans living in Havana. President McKinley reluctantly thought of the Maine.
There was a rumor aboard one of the ships a couple of weeks ago that we were to proceed to Havana, but the order was postponed. I was thinking of making out a will when I heard that. Thomas Troy, coal passer.
Captain Sigsbee received his orders the evening of January 24, 1898. Proceed to Havana, the cable read, and make friendly call. With his customary coolness, Captain Sigsbee ordered the Maine to steam up and head south. They made their way slowly so as not to arrive in Havana too early. Sigsbee wanted the city to be alive and on its feet for the arrival of the battleship Maine.
Captain Sigsbee had made sure that all the men looked great. They were on deck. Every flag was flying. He slowed her speed as they approached the harbor entrance, giving the entire city, and anyone in there that wanted to see them could certainly see them coming.
Although the Maine was officially on a friendly visit, cruising in under the guns of El Morro made the entire crew uneasy.
The men on deck were very concerned. They were worried about the reception they would receive. In fact, live ammunition had been brought up on the deck. Captain Sigsbee had ordered live ammunition stored within the gun turrets so that the Spanish and the harbor authorities could not see it. But they were ready for action. They had no idea how they were going to be received.
A Havana harbor pilot boat cautiously approached the Maine to guide her to her mooring.
When the pilot came on board, he was shaking like a leaf. And he brought the Maine inching down this long passageway into the harbor, inching, inching, inching. Crowds by this time were lining this passageway on either side. And imagine the tension, because this is hostile territory, really, really hostile territory. And finally they got to the harbor and they led him to one particular mooring, which has been speculated about whether that particular mooring might not have been mined, but who knows.
The Maine, now safely tethered to her mooring, her cannons fired a ritual salute to the flag of Spain. The Maine had arrived in Havana without incident. The reaction of the Spaniards to the arrival of the Maine was lukewarm at best. Captain Sigsbee paid his respects to all the necessary dignitaries, then opened the ship up to receive visitors during the day. He denied the enlisted men shore leave for the duration of their visit in Havana, feeling the presence of American sailors would not mix well with the tensions on shore. Security was tightened and extra safety precautions were taken on board the Maine.
By the looks of things now, I think we'll have some trouble before we leave. We're in a pretty dangerous position at the present time, and we hardly know when we're safe. Sending my best love and wishes to all, and hoping that I may be alive to see you all again. I remain your loving son, Charles Hamilton, Ship's Apprentice.
Captain Sigsbee was aware that there was an element in Havana that strongly opposed the battleship Maine being there. There were warnings, leaflets being distributed in the city of Havana that said the battleship would be destroyed, as would the American government if she decided to invade Cuba.
There was a lot of effort made to be sure that the Maine was kept protected. There was extra watches put on. There was constant observation of visitors aboard ship to be sure that there was no bringing of any kind of munitions aboard, anything along that line. The longer the Maine was in Havana Harbor, the less tense the situation was. Towards last, the men were expecting to be able to leave Havana without incident.
We are a little afraid here, but I think we will go to New Orleans next week. Thomas Troy, coal passer.
After being restricted for 3 weeks aboard a steel battleship in the heat of the tropics, the crew of the Maine was looking forward to leaving Havana and proceeding to New Orleans, where they were to preside over the Mardi Gras festivities. The date was February 15th, 1898. The sun had just set on another steamy day. The notes from taps hung in the humid air as the sailors retired to their hammocks for the night.
Around 9:40, the men aboard the Maine felt a shudder, followed by a massive explosion. The ship instantly went dark. There was confusion everywhere. The men aboard ship who had survived the initial blast were in an area that was completely alien to them. Where they thought things should be, they no longer were. Trying to find your way out of the ship was a major crisis.
The explosion was so violent that it actually moved the other ships in the harbor, physically pushing them.
Captain Sigsbee was in the rear of the ship where the officers' quarters were located, finishing a letter to his wife when the explosion occurred. His first thought was that the Maine was under attack. He felt his way in the darkness along the corridor to the main deck. Once there, he found a handful of his officers standing in a daze as explosions continued around them.
I had to wade in water up to my knees, and almost instantly the quarterdeck was awash. On the poop, I found Captain Sigsbee, as cool as if at a ball. Lieutenant John Blandon.
This thing out there.
Keep it steady,
But we have men out in the water.
I felt myself turning over and over, falling heavily upon the deck through a mass of smoke. I got on my feet and worked my way on the deck. When I got there, the superstructure deck was dipping underwater, and I jumped overboard to keep from being drawn down in the suction. Jim Rowe, ship's cook.
Michael Blow is a descendant of one of the officers on board the Maine. His grandfather, Lieutenant George Preston Blow, survived the explosion.
On the morning of February 16th, he somehow managed to find time to write grandmother. And what he said was this: whether we were torpedoed by the Spanish, blown up by
a mine, or whether the Cubans did it to bring on a war, or whether it was one of those spontaneous explosions, we do not know. Lieutenant George Preston Blow.
The majority of the crew were in their hammocks in the bow of the ship at the time of the explosion. 250 men died instantly, some of their bodies crushed to less than a half-inch in thickness. The remaining men were hurled into the harbor. The wreck of the Maine quickly sank to rest on the harbor bottom, the top of her deck now even with the surrounding waters. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately to pull survivors out of the water. Grisel Rodriguez Sierra is the granddaughter of one of the Havana harbor pilots who assisted in the rescue.
The day of the tragedy of the Maine in Havana Bay, a spontaneous rescue operation took place right after the disaster. The local people that resided along the bay, pilots and fishermen, all joined forces to rescue the survivors and later to retrieve the bodies of those that didn't make it. My grandfather, who was one of the most important pilots in the bay, also joined them. As usual, he brought along my uncle, Gabriel, who at the time was 13 or 14 years old. The young boy was always in the company of my grandfather because he was being trained to become a pilot also. It seems that the boy became traumatized by the experience of seeing so many dead bodies floating in the bay, because one night shortly after the recovery effort started, he came home with a very high fever. He became delirious. The fever would not recede, and a few days after that, he died. It was a terrible tragedy, as my mother would tell us. My father had told her about the terrifying image of the bodies floating in the bay. It was was shocking for everyone. The saddest part that will always stay with our family was the death of my uncle caused by the vision of it.
As the search for survivors continued in the days after the explosion, an unlikely rescue occurred. The ship's mascot, Tom, was found huddling in the wreckage.
As for Tom, the ship's cat, Tom was also rescued. They went back to the ship. Much of the superstructure remained above water, and they found Tom there. He had been hiding for 3 days from terror, but they found him and got him off.
The night of the explosion, Sigsbee sent a telegram to Key West that the Maine had been destroyed. 266 of his crew died as a result of the explosion. Only 88 survived. Sigsbee urged that public opinion be suspended until further report. But the New York Yellow journalist went wild with speculation. Remember the Maine, down with Spain, became the journal's exuberant new war cry as circulation passed the 1 million mark. Despite the increasing clamor from Congress and the American public, President McKinley refused to make any decisions until a U.S. Court of Inquiry had completed a full investigation. Back in Cuba, an elaborate funeral procession for the Maine's dead crew members filed its way through the streets of Havana to Colón Cemetery, where the bodies were buried. 1 month later, the Court of Inquiry completed its investigation. The Maine disaster resulted from the explosion of a mine situated under the bottom of the ship, read the official report. McKinley could no longer quell the public clamor for vengeance. Congress officially declared war on Spain on April 25, 1898, and the call for volunteers went out. The Spanish-American War truly was a splendid little war for the U.S. The Spaniards, weakened by decades of fighting Cuban insurgents, were easy targets. More American soldiers died from contracting tropical diseases than died on the battlefield. The whole conflict was over in less than 4 months. As a result of the Spanish-American War, America would gain control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and the Hawaiian Islands. These acquisitions instantly catapulted the United States into world power status. The strategic ownership of these islands would play a major role in the global expansion of the U.S.
Now, operating out of these coaling bases around the world, we had a worldwide Navy. As a result of having a worldwide Navy, we could now have a worldwide commercial fleet, which meant the United States could now expand commercially around the world. It's one of the most important aspects of the war that made the United States into not only a world military power, but a world commercial power.
But what of the Maine, that fateful ship that started it all, the catalyst to American expansionism at the turn of the century? The twisted wreck of the Maine sat forlornly in Havana Harbor throughout the war and for another decade after the peace treaties were signed.
The wreck sat in that harbor, half out of the water and half under the water, rusting away for 11 years, 12 years. It was an eyesore. It was in the way of shipping in the harbor. The Cubans didn't want it there. People in the United States, of course, they wanted it brought back, mostly in their reverence for the people that died on it, and their bodies were still in the wreck.
Over 65 bodies of crew members were still entombed in the wreck of the Maine. Their shipmates, who had originally been buried in Colón Cemetery in Havana, had been brought back to the U.S. and buried at Arlington Cemetery at the end of the war. Patriotic groups pressed hard for the recovery of these remaining bodies so they could be properly interred in American soil. In 1909, Congress began to appropriate funds to raise the Maine. The Army Corps of Engineers was assigned the formidable task of refloating the battleship. The engineers came up with the idea of building a cofferdam.
A cofferdam is an enclosure that you put in the water to hold the water back while you lower the water inside the coffer. And of course you have to remember this ship was larger than a football field. So the cofferdam had to be constructed watertight and structurally capable of holding back those formidable forces of water and mud. And men had to work inside of that cofferdam, so it can't fail. If that cofferdam fails, everyone inside is killed. So it was a very, very critical construction project.
The cofferdam consisted of 20 interlocking cylinders filled with clay and gravel. The 400-foot cofferdam, the biggest one ever built, was completed in 6 months. In June of 1911, the engineers began pumping out the water, slowly exposing the wreck of the Maine. A second Navy investigation was launched to examine the exhumed battleship for new evidence as to the cause of the explosion. After exhaustive study, the board concurred with the initial findings of the first court of inquiry. The Maine exploded due to an external mine. Inside the Maine, bones and human remains were found. Trinkets and personal effects were also salvaged.
Certain parts were salvaged to be used for monuments around the country. The congressmen enjoyed giving their constituents a piece of the Maine that they could show it off in their town as a memorial. There was one gun turret where they took the guns off of the old wreck, and these were the 10-inch guns, and they were removed intact. They weighed 29 tons each, and they were taken up and given to the Cuban government. And supposedly the purpose of giving them to the Cuban government was to build a monument to the Maine in the city of Havana.
That monument, featuring the guns of the Maine, was erected in Havana overlooking the harbor where the ship was destroyed. A little worse for wear, the monument still stands today, a testament to the fallen crewmen of the Maine. Once the water inside the cofferdam was pumped out, the Maine's twisted bow was cut off and a wooden bulkhead attached. The water was then slowly added back into the cofferdam, and the Maine began to float again for the first time in 14 years. On March 16, 1912, the Maine prepared for her final mission, a ceremonial re-sinking in the open sea. Her deck strewn with roses and a huge American flag secured to a makeshift mast, the Maine was escorted out of Havana Harbor. Spectators thronged the waterfront to watch the Maine take her final journey. She was towed 3 miles out into international waters, then a little bit further until the ship was over a deep trench.
And then as they were playing the Star-Spangled Banner and as they played taps, the Maine sunk. It took 41 minutes for the Maine to sink, but no explosives were used. It was just gently sunk. She was sunk in about 650 fathoms of water, and that's where she still lies today.
The mysteries of the Maine seemed forever laid to rest until 1976, when Navy Admiral Hyman Rickover published his book on how the battleship Maine was destroyed. His interest piqued by the unsolved mystery, Admiral Rickover felt that the knowledge amassed over the years on the effects of explosions on steel ships could be freshly applied to the evidence on the Maine's explosion. he called on the Navy's finest experts to work on the project. Dana Wegner, Navy Curator of Ships Models, was on Rickover's team.
I was a historical researcher for Admiral Rickover at the time, so when he asked us what we knew about the Maine and to tell him what we could find out about the Maine, we went rushing to the National Archives and found all the books and everything that we could get our hands on as fast as possible to report back to him on exactly what was known up till that time about the loss of the ship.
Rickover's team applied modern scientific methods to the old photographs and testimonies from the Maine's 2 investigations.
The major conclusion that our team reached was that there was no evidence that anything outside the ship exploded and caused the ammunition on board the Maine to explode. What we believe probably happened was that the coal dust in the bottom of one of the bunkers adjacent to the 6-inch reserve magazine heated up to probably red or white hot temperature, slowly ate a small hole through the wall between the coal bunker and the magazine, and was able to transmit heat either through its own transmission powers or through radiation high enough to start the ammunition in the forward part of the ship exploding by itself. Now, there were about 72,000 pounds of brown prismatic powder in the front magazines of the Maine. We believe only 14 to 28% of that powder exploded, so it was not nearly the entire amount of ammunition on board the front part of the ship. It was only a fraction of it. But that alone was enough to blow the front of the ship open like a tin can being run over by a railroad locomotive.
Since the mid-70s, the Rickover report has been widely accepted as the leading theory on the true cause of the Maine explosion. Spontaneous combustion in coal bunkers was a common problem in the early steel battleships. Munitions were often stored adjacent to the coal bunkers, adding to the potential danger. The stored coal in the Maine was monitored by a heat-sensing alarm system, and the bunkers were inspected daily. As the crew walked along the narrow passageways, the men would habitually place their hands along the bunker bulkheads, checking for telltale signs of heat. Some historians dispute Rickover's findings, stating that failure by the crew to detect a coal bunker fire would be highly unlikely.
The fact is, this suspect bunker, which came up in the Rickover report, was open on 3 sides, and crewmen used it as a kind of a lounging place. If there had been excessive heat there, they certainly would have noticed it. In addition to that, it was inspected once a day. So all in all, it seems difficult to believe that the heat was coming from that source.
Mystery surrounds the explosion of the Maine. In fact, it's moved past mystery into legend and myth. The studies that I've done and the research that I've done and everything I've read suggests to me that the battleship Maine was exploded by a marine mine that was set in Havana Harbor.
Even those who believe that the Maine was a victim of treachery can't agree when it comes to naming the guilty party. Although no one ever stepped forward to claim responsibility, many groups had the motive to blow up the Maine. The Cuban insurgents may have done it in an attempt to coax America into their war. The hothead Whalerites might have blown up the ship as a message to the Yankee imperialists. William Randolph Hearst had been accused of destroying the ship to increase circulation. To this day, school children in Cuba are taught that America blew up its own ship just for the excuse to expand its borders. The Spaniards, who were originally blamed for the explosion, had the least to gain, and in retrospect have almost entirely been absolved.
She will always live on as this mystery and this legend, this myth. And that brings her great credit, I believe, great credit to the United States Navy and the people of the United States, but especially those men who died on the battleship in that horrible explosion, February of 1898.
The Cuban research vessel Ulysses is unlike any other ship in Cuba. She has been specially outfitted for an extraordinary mission: to locate and recover deep water targets in the trenches surrounding the island country. Cuba's long history as a port of call, combined with treacherous currents and a unique coastal geology, has created an underwater museum of multiple shipwrecks peppered off the Cuban shoreline. Paulina Zalitsky is the leader of the international team of scientists committed to searching and studying Cuba's deep waters. Born in Russia, Zalitsky had come to Cuba in 1967 as part of a Soviet team of scientists. Now a Canadian citizen, Zalitsky was approached by Cuba once again, this time to help them explore their own deep waters. She formed a team of young Cuban engineers aided by scientists from around the world, including American scientists. Zalitsky's son, Ernie Tapanis, has been involved with the project from the beginning.
Cuba doesn't have the technology to explore their waters. They lack the funds to pay for the technologies that are now available. Cuba has the heart and the manpower and the personnel that want to learn and want to do this type of work, but they simply don't have access to the technologies or the funds that are required to possess those technologies.
I never expected to be doing something like this. This is a job that requires a lot of study, work, and personal effort. It keeps you constantly active. You never find a minute to rest because there is always something to learn or to do. It is very labor-intensive work.
It is a unique opportunity indeed, one that I never dreamed would come my way. To me, this is a journey of discovery. The search for sunken ships and the practice of archaeology in deep water are some real challenging adventures. But what truly makes this quest so exciting is the technology that we are using.
Deep water exploration is an extremely difficult undertaking. In many ways, more is known about the surface of the moon than about the bottom of the ocean. The incredible pressures related with these depths, along with below freezing temperatures and utter darkness, make deep water exploration a highly technical and expensive process. Originally designed to be a fishing trawler, the Ulysses was converted to a Cuban scientific research vessel in 1987. But to effectively function in deep water search and recovery, the Ulysses had to be re-outfitted with the latest technology, including acoustic positioning equipment, a deep water towing survey system, and an underwater remotely operated vehicle, or ROV. All these systems must work together to accurately find targets on the ocean floor. The team decided that their first mission would be to locate the wreck of the battleship Maine. The unusual wedge shape of the Maine and abundance of historical photos made the Maine an ideal test subject for their new equipment.
No one knew exactly where the Maine was. They know that it was towed out from the Morro Castle, and they knew that it was resunk in about 600 fathoms, but they didn't know how far it might possibly have drifted, and back in 1912 there wasn't really, they didn't have GPS and global positioning systems then, so no one knew the exact location.
The first step is to isolate the area to be searched. The team pours through historical records to determine what area to investigate.
The historical records that we have and that you can find anywhere state that she was towed directly out from Morro Castle. Others state that she was towed out at a certain bearing. But what's really the most important to remember and to understand is that there are currents outside of Cuba.
Frank Muller Carger, a marine scientist from the University of South Florida, has worked aboard the Ulysses studying these strong currents surrounding Cuba.
It's not surprising that the Maine could have drifted some from the point it was last, where the last sighting was made, because there's some very strong currents off the coast of Cuba. That's the whole Gulf Stream system. Something that is sinking in these strong currents can drift some distance, and then even if, depends on what it is, can be dragged along the bottom.
After plotting an 11-square-mile testing zone, a tethered towfish is released and dragged behind the ship. The towfish contains a magnetometer to help detect metal signatures and a side-scan sonar system. The side scan emits sound waves through the water, which reflect off objects on the ocean floor, painting a picture of what lies beneath the ship.
You analyze the side scan records and you try to determine what are man-made objects, what reflections you get back that don't seem natural, that don't look natural. You know, nature has a way of round edges and smooth items and, things looking natural. And what we're looking for is more man-made objects. Square corners, straight lines, objects that look like they're out of place, they don't really belong there.
The images from the side scan feed into the ship's computer, while a special beacon on the towfish tells the ship's positioning equipment the exact location of the towfish. After interpreting the side scan images, dozens of potential targets are mapped. Many of these are doubtless ships that failed to successfully navigate Cuba's perilous currents or that succumbed to the attacks of bandits. The team begins to focus on one oddly shaped target.
I had a very strong suspicion that that wreck was going to be the Maine because of the shape of the target. We nicknamed it Square because the target itself on the side scan sonar had a very square shape to it, and it looked like one part of the target had been cut, and to me it seemed like a very unnatural shape that was there.
The decision is made to send out the ROV to investigate the Square. The ROV is a tethered underwater robot equipped with lights, cameras, and a multifunctional arm capable of picking up small objects. Controlled by a joystick, operating the ROV is much like playing a very expensive video game.
Ahí hay mucha tensión. Estamos hablando de un equipamiento que cuesta alrededor de
There is a lot of stress involved.
que no puedes perder.
We're talking about a piece of equipment that cost $500,000, and you can't lose it.
Además, estás buscando algo emocionante, ¿no? Estás buscando un pez.
Even though you may get swept away by emotion when you find things that you have struggled and labored so hard to find, you can never lose focus on keeping the ROV safe.
El equipo está ahí que no puedes.
The ROV is housed in a garage of sorts. The entire unit is lowered into the water, and the ROV motors out of its metal retaining frame. Capable of exploring depths up to 2,500 meters or over 1.5 miles, the ROV heads towards today's target, the Square, resting 2/3 of a mile down.
I wasn't expecting to come on it so quickly. The vehicle had only been in the water about, I think, 5-10 minutes before we actually started seeing images of the wreck on the screen.
That's it. Sí, one last. This is Battleship Maine. Congratulations. Hey.
Para la mayoría de nosotros, no era.
In the beginning, nobody agreed. For the majority of us, it was not the Maine.
Creo que una de las personas que más
I think the person that insisted the most that it was the Maine was Paulina. She always said it was the Maine.
ese es Maine para ahí.
Everybody argued with me because when I first noticed the striped cat, I shouted that it was Maine, and everybody was arguing with me. They ended up by throwing me out of control room because I insisted that it was Maine.
Disagreements are temporarily cast aside as the ROV operator signals to the crew that there is a problem. The garage for the ROV is not responding to the command to recoil the tether and bring the ROV back to the ship.
We had to retrieve ROV and tether management systems separately from the depths of 1,500 meters. We were very worried. We thought, well, we knew that we could lose ROV.
As the ROV breaks the surface, the team springs into action to recover the costly equipment.
Yeah, I understand.
We got baby home.
With the ROV now safely on the deck of the Ulysses, the team analyzes the video of the wreck below them. It is indeed the battleship Maine. Strong currents had carried her over half a mile east from the location of her ceremonial resinking in 1912.
We confirmed the wreck as the U.S. Maine by going through a lot of archival photographs, articles, drawings, old film footage.
It's very well preserved. We were quite surprised to see how well it was preserved.
The Maine has been preserved very well in these deeper waters of Cuba. The waters are relatively cold and saline, and you probably have very low biological activity as opposed to the ship being at a shallower depth. So the environmental conditions are just better to preserving materials at that depth off of Cuba. The Cubans consider the Maine U.S. property even still today, and they have respected it. It's sort of a neutral ground that has common history, and it's common positive history for both sides. So I think it's a good place where scientists and researchers can rally around without getting tangled into today's politics and go on to positive themes off from there.
When I was growing up, we discussed the Maine in school as something that was part of history that nobody could ever see again. But we had the opportunity to be right in front of it, almost to touch it through our equipment. That was a sensation like no other, something that will stay with me forever.
Science is our international responsibility. It's not a responsibility of one nation. And since we share that responsibility, the best way of executing it is doing it together.
The mystery of who blew up the Maine will never definitively be solved. The hulk that remains holds no new clues as to the cause of the disaster. To many, the Rickover report laid the question to rest over 25 years ago. To others, the explosion of the Maine was America's first experience with faceless terrorism, an act of violence that forever changed a young nation. Regardless of its source, the explosion of the Maine rallied a whole country behind a cause, bitter feelings left over from the Civil War were forgotten. America was a country united for the first time. And while the chain of events that followed the destruction of the Maine reshaped the entire world, this unity was the greatest gift received from the sacrifice of the brave crew of the battleship Maine.